Live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Waldman. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? Let us pretend for the moment that it is Friday, August 31st, and I'm bringing you a live show. You don't actually have to pretend it's a live show. I've ruined the illusion as it is. However, another Friday in the summertime when I've had to pre-tape the show, and you know what that means. That's right, a 2-hour show about Saudi Arabia. Saudish Arabia, as we like to call it on the show. I'm telling you, I've got a lot of background information that people have been producing for your benefit. I thought I would share it with you and get up to speed on all of the reporting on the background of Mohammed bin Salman, and that is MBS, as they know him in the Middle East, and his counterpart in the United Arab Emirates, MBZ, but we'll be focusing on MBS today. A piece that I referenced in one of our previous Saudish Fridays and never really got to share with you. This time, a Saudi princess, quest to remake the Middle East. This is a Dexter Filkins piece in New Yorker and dated April 2nd, 2018. I've been wanting to share this one with you for some time, and only now have we got the opportunity to do it. And it presents itself as an opportunity in particular because there is an accompanying piece, or a piece that I will force to accompany this one, that is pretty much brand new out there in Newsweek. Rula Jebrial is the author of this piece. Saudi Arabia's Mohammed bin Salman charmed the West, but rules at home with an iron fist. So a brand new profile of MBS and what he's up to there in Saudi Arabia and what he's doing with respect to developing relations with the West and the United States in particular. So this presents a great opportunity to bring you this New Yorker piece, which I think we should get to without further ado. Once again, then, from the April 2nd, 2018 edition of the New Yorker, A Saudi Prince's Quest to Remake the Middle East by Dexter Filkins. In his work with the White House, is Mohammed bin Salman driving out extremism or merely seizing power for himself? Good question. Let's see how it's answered here. A few days after Donald Trump was inaugurated, Jared Kushner sat down to decide how to reshape the Middle East. During the campaign, Trump had promised a sweeping transformation of the region. Steve Bannon, Trump's senior advisor and ideologist, how do you like that, at the time, told me recently, quote, "Our plan was to annihilate the physical caliphate of ISIS in Iraq and Syria. Not attrition, annihilation, roar, and to roll back the Persians, and force the Gulf states to stop funding radical Islam." The Middle East Initiative, Bannon said, was one of the few points of agreement in an otherwise fractious White House. We should just cure everything. Yeah, we all agree. Jared and I were at war on a number of other topics, but not this. Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, was put in charge of policy for the region. He had no experience in diplomacy or in Middle Eastern politics. At 36, he had spent his working life managing New York and New Jersey real estate projects and running the New York Observer, a fading tabloid. But a former senior defense official who worked with Kushner told me he had been educating himself on the fly. He's not a scholar on this stuff, the official said. His knowledge is gained from talking to movers and shakers in that part of the world. You can read a lot of books, but never get the type of education you might get from talking to the Kissingers and Petraeuses of the world. That is true. In a conference room at the White House, Kushner met with aides from the National Security Council. "We took out the map and assessed the situation," the former defense official said. Surveying the region, they concluded that the northern tier of the Middle East had been lost to Iran. In Lebanon, Hezbollah, an Iranian proxy, controlled the government. In Syria, Iran helped save President Bashar al-Assad from military disaster and was now bolstering his political future. In Iraq, the government, nominally pro-American, was also under the sway of Tehran. We kind of set those to the side, the official told me. We thought, so then what? Our anchors were Israel and Saudi Arabia. We can't be successful in the Gulf without Saudi Arabia. That meant reversing the approach supported by Barack Obama, who, unlike previous presidents, had kept the Saudis at arm's length, objecting to their repressive internal policies, their treatment of women, and their aggressive posture toward Iran. Obama, in effect, hoped to create a kind of balance between Riyadh and Tehran. In March 2016, he told the journalist Jeffrey Goldberg that the unsteady condition of the Middle East requires us to say to our friends, as well as to the Iranians, that they need to find an effective way to share the neighborhood and institute some sort of cold peace. Trump and Kushner wanted no such détente. Everything we could do to strengthen our relationship with the Saudis we were going to do, the former defense official told me. Above all, that meant forming a new alliance with Saudi Arabia's deputy crown prince, Mohammed bin Salman, known in the White House and throughout the Middle East as MBS. Bin Salman, though only 31, was already one of the most powerful people in the kingdom. The son of the current monarch, and that makes it hard not to be one of the most popular, or rather not popular, but powerful people in the kingdom. He was the Minister of Defense, chairman of the committee that charted the kingdom's economy, and second in line to the throne. So it was pretty well solidified, I think. In a country long ruled by aging kings, MBS was young, tall, and transparently ambitious. He wanted to wean the kingdom from its unsustainable addiction to oil and to diversify its economy. And he promised to end the long-standing arrangement of Saudi domestic politics in which the royal family and its myriad princes bought off political opposition by allowing radical Islamists to propagate their creed and even carry out terrorist attacks abroad. MBS was uncompromising in foreign policy, describing the mullahs who presided over Iran as akin to Nazis. Oh, tut, you cannot do that. The question for many analysts around the world was whether he represented genuine reform or was merely using the language of reform to consolidate power. As Kushner grappled with the complexities of Middle East politics, he and MBS began a conversation by telephone and email. They became close very fast. A former American official who sees MBS periodically said, "They see the world in the same way. They see themselves as being in the tech-savvy money world." Kushner followed up with a visit to Riyadh, the first of 3 such trips. The two men stayed up nearly until dawn, discussing the future of their countries. As Kushner knew, MBS was involved in a messy battle over succession to the throne, which American security officials warned might destabilize the kingdom. And MBS had his own ideas about how to remake the Middle East, but Bannon told me, the message that he and Kushner wanted Trump to convey to the region's leaders was that the status quo had to change, and in the more places, the better. We said to them, Trump said to them, "We'll support you, but we want action." Action, Bannon said. No one seemed more eager to hear that message than the deputy crown prince. The judgment was that we needed to find a change agent, the former defense official told me. That's where MBS came in. We were going to embrace him as the change agent. When Mohammed bin Salman was growing up in Riyadh, he lived in a walled palace complex the size of a city block, sharing a mansion with his 5 brothers and his mother, Fada, one of his father's 4 wives. Each wife had a mansion of her own. For most of his childhood, his father, Salman, was the governor of Riyadh and a likely future king. The family's home in the Madher neighborhood had a staff of about 50, including servants, gardeners, maids, cooks, and drivers. Each weekday, the staff ferried the young prince to class at a prestigious academy called the Al-Riyadh Schools. On weekends, the servants sometimes escorted him and his classmates into the desert, where they erected large tents and lit bonfires under the stars. His fellow students would gather around him and recite poems of praise, calling him Karim, the generous one, for sponsoring the lavish parties. The young MBS would smile at the encomiums, especially if they came from a son of one of Riyadh's better families. He treated everyone well, but even then, he was aware of everyone's status. This is a great name. Mahbub Mohammed. Terrific. A Pakistani who worked on the staff of one of MBS's cousins told me. Prince Salman always knew he was special. That is sweet. Still, even for the young Salman, the future was cloudy, due in no small part to the uncertain line of royal succession in the House of Saud. Since 1953, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and don't forget it is a kingdom, one of the world's last surviving absolute monarchies, has been ruled by 6 brothers, all sons of King Abdulaziz Al Saud. Abdulaziz is the central figure in modern Saudi Arabia, having united the kingdom in 1932 after a series of wars. Remember, that's how it became Saudi Arabia, and it might well have been Rashidi Arabia had the wars gone the other way. In the 40s, returning to the article, he opened the country to large-scale oil production by Western companies, and after meeting President Franklin Roosevelt on an American destroyer in the Red Sea, struck an alliance with the United States, which has endured ever since. The Saudis guarantee access to oil. The U.S. in return guarantees Saudi Arabia security from foreign enemies. Abdulaziz was a prolific father. He bragged of having married no fewer than 135 virgins. Terrific. And sired at least 42 sons and 55 daughters. Since his death in 1953, royal succession has been determined on the principle of agnatic seniority, whereby a king's younger brother is preferred over his sons. In 2015, when his successor King Abdullah died, his brother Salman ascended to the throne, and another younger brother named Mukrin became crown prince. Mukrin, the son of a Yemeni concubine, was Abdulaziz's last surviving son. As the generation of Abdulaziz's sons neared its end, tensions rose over who would be the first member of the next generation to become king. Saudi kings, though absolute in their authority, have traditionally ruled by consensus among the brothers. Their sons, in turn, are placed in key positions across the government. Any one of Abdulaziz's hundreds of grandsons could feel entitled to the throne. Salman, during 48 years as governor of Riyadh, had earned a reputation as a ruthlessly efficient executive. He was the family enforcer. He kept people in line, and he had a file on everyone. Rashid Khalidi, a professor of history at Columbia, told me, that's the end of the last sentence. He was the family enforcer. He kept people in line, and he had a file on everyone. Rashid Khalidi, a professor of history at Columbia, told me. Less than a year after becoming king, he removed his brother as crown prince and sent him into retirement. He elevated his nephew, Mohammed bin Nayef, to succeed him, and made his own son, Mohammed bin Salman, deputy crown prince. Displacing a crown prince was an unprecedented move, but in many respects, bin Nayef was a solid choice for a successor. For years, he had served as interior minister. After the attacks of September 11th, he had presided over a vicious fight with al-Qaeda, in which his security forces tortured and killed suspected insurgents. In 2009, the group retaliated by sending a suicide bomber to kill bin Nayef, who suffered damage to one hand and lasting pain from his injuries. Bin Nayef forged close relationships with American officials. He was the go-to person on counterterrorism, a senior counterterrorism official in the Obama administration told me. For King Salman, the choice of bin Nayef was politically astute for another reason. His only children were 2 daughters, which meant that his ascension could be less threatening to others because no one in his bloodline could succeed him. The selection of MBS as deputy crown prince promised less stability. At 29 years old, he was younger than many of his rivals, but undeniably King Salman's favorite. Joseph Westphal, the U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia from 2013 to 2017, told me that whenever Salman introduced MBS to a stranger, he said with evident pride, "This is my son." Westphal recalled watching a video recorded when MBS was a teenager in which Salman visited an industrial plant with 2 of his sons, Faisal and MBS. Faisal, who is 15 years older, walked passively, while MBS asked questions and scribbled notes incessantly. Salman watched him and beamed. He was in key meetings all the time, never interfering, just taking notes, but always switched on, Westphal said of MBS. I saw right away that this guy was going to be more than just a silent advisor to the king. MBS gives the impression of being comfortable with Western mores. In meetings with American women, he shakes their hands and looks them in the eye, which not every Saudi official would do. Once, during a meeting at the home of Secretary of State John Kerry, MBS spotted a grand piano, walked over, and began playing the Moonlight Sonata. His favorite diversion is Call of Duty, the video game. But his English is halting, and among his brothers, he has 9, he is unusually bound to Saudi Arabia. MBS is unlike his brothers, several of whom were educated in the West, and one of whom has a doctorate from Oxford. A longtime friend of MBS told me, if you look at them and you talk to them, they are basically soft. And there is this quality to MBS. The guy's not soft. He has a lot of charisma. He's a lot like Bill Clinton. He makes you feel like you're super important when you're talking to him. He really puts on a charm that is unmistakable. As MBS grew into adulthood, he brazenly used his status to enrich himself. Aha, perfect. In his teens, according to people who know him, he visited a series of wealthy businessmen and asked them to put money into his personal investment fund. In a matter of weeks, he raised $30 million. He's the son of Salman, MBS's friend told me. It's not like anyone was going to say no. According to a story that circulates in Riyadh, MBS demanded that a Saudi land registry official help him appropriate a property. After the official refused, he received an envelope with a single bullet inside. The episode earned MBS the street name Abu Rasasa, or Father of the Bullet. The story is true, the friend said. I think that MBS realizes that he went too far toward some people in those days, and he has tried to make amends. A spokesman for the Saudi embassy denied the story, but largely declined to cooperate with fact-checking for the rest of the article, describing it as full of old, incorrect rumors. In addition to being Deputy Crown Prince, MBS was appointed to positions that gave him vast powers over foreign and domestic policy. He was named Defense Minister, head of the kingdom's Economic Planning Council, and chief of Aramco, the national oil company, and the central pillar of the country's economy. In the 70 years since Saudi Arabia began exporting oil at scale, it has grown into the largest economy in the Middle East, with a welfare state whose benefits include free education and health care, along with subsidized food, electricity, and housing. But the economy relies overwhelmingly on oil. The country exports almost nothing else and imports almost everything else, from food to fresh water. The welfare state was built on the expectation that the price of oil would remain at historic levels of at least $100 a barrel. It is now $62 and is widely predicted to keep falling. If you are the guy driving the Saudi bus, my advice would be to get off it as soon as you can. Jan Stewart, an energy economist in New York, told me. The former defense official put it even more starkly. In 5 to 7 years, at current trends, they're broke. Wow. Uh-oh. The economic pressures on the Saudi state are likely to get worse. Close to 70% of the population is under 30 years old. Every year, the government pays for as many as 70,000 young people to study in the United States. Those students return home wanting jobs and often at least some of the freedoms that they enjoyed in the West. To address these concerns, MBS devised a plan called Vision 2030 for a vast transformation of the Saudi economy and society. Working with consultants from McKinsey & Company, he set quantifiable goals to be met in the next decade. The new order would encourage entrepreneurship and foreign investment and privatize state-owned industries, including the oil business. The workforce would be augmented by a growing number of women, along with nonprofit organizations and civic-minded volunteers. To publicize the plan, MBS traveled to China, to Russia, and to the U.S., where he met with an array of tech executives, including Mark Zuckerberg. At a gathering of prominent venture capitalists at the Fairmont Hotel in San Francisco, MBS spoke bluntly about Saudi Arabia's prospects. According to one attendee, he said, "In 20 years, oil goes to zero and then renewables take over. I have 20 years to reorient my country and launch it into the future." The attendee said, "My jaw was on the floor. The meeting had the dynamic of a tech startup. He's throwing the harpoon." I have no idea what that is supposed to mean. Are they whales like in the boiler room sense? I don't know. Okay. MBS's appointments also allowed him to display his apparently irrepressible ambition. In April 2016, when President Obama paid his final visit to Saudi Arabia, he and King Salman sat facing each other with their aides grouped around them. Obama's advisors noticed that each time the president spoke, Salman, who was 80, paused before answering, while MBS, seated several seats to his left, typed on an iPad. When MBS finished, the king read from an iPad of his own and then responded to Obama. The chances of that being a coincidence are quite low, a former national security official told me. At another meeting, Obama upbraided King Salman for arresting dissident bloggers and for executing Shiite protesters, complaining that these practices made it difficult for him to defend the Saudis in the United States. According to several former American officials, MBS rose abruptly from his chair to convey his displeasure to Obama. Suddenly, he was standing up and saying, "You don't understand our judicial system. We can get you a briefing," the former national security officer said. It was very strange. When King Salman named bin Nayef crown prince, some Saudis speculated that the king envisioned him as a sort of caretaker, running the government until MBS could be installed. I don't think Salman ever intended to make bin Nayef king, a prominent Saudi analyst told me. I think he was just waiting for the moment when MBS was ready. But bin Nayef was a popular figure, and bypassing him would have aroused resistance within the royal family. Outwardly, MBS and bin Nayef worked smoothly together. MBS adhered carefully to royal protocol. At meetings with foreign leaders, he sometimes asked bin Nayef's permission to speak. In 2016, Joseph Westphal asked MBS who he thought would succeed King Salman. He said, "We have a crown prince, and historically the crown prince always becomes the king," Westphal told me. Under the surface, though, tensions grew as MBS maneuvered to reduce his rival's power. His directorship of the economy and the military allowed him to crowd out bin Nayef's daily duties. In the name of streamlining the government, he eliminated a council of advisors who answered to bin Nayef, depriving him of most of his professional staff. A former American official who maintains contacts in the region told me MBS was literally signing orders in the king's name. Saudi Arabia sees itself as the center of the Islamic world. The king is customarily known as the custodian of the two holy mosques, the sacred sites in Mecca and Medina. But as MBS gained power, he was aided by an ally from outside the kingdom, Mohammed bin Zayed of the United Arab Emirates. Bin Zayed, or MBZ, as we know, is the crown prince of Abu Dhabi, the most politically important of the country's 7 emirates. Flush with revenue from oil and from the booming city-state of Dubai, MBZ, the country's de facto leader, has helped build the Emirates into a kind of Middle Eastern Singapore, rich, efficient, and authoritarian. MBZ, 57, is a former military helicopter pilot with a modest bearing that belies his influence throughout the Middle East. If you sit down to talk with MBZ, he's going to whisper, and he's going to be very respectful and very polite. Richard Clark, you remember him, counterterrorism advisor to Presidents Obama and George W. Bush. That's what he told our author here. You really have to get into his confidence over many years before he will raise his voice, and then he'll argue with you. He is unabashedly pro-American in a region teeming with anti-American sentiment. He has purchased billions of dollars worth of American weapons and has often been called on to advance U.S. prerogatives. In 2003, the UAE volunteered to send a small contingent of troops to assist in Afghanistan, the first Arab country to do so. 15 years later, they are still there. Saudi Arabia and the UAE, which share a border, are both hereditary monarchies, both dominated by Sunnis, and their interests often align. In foreign affairs, Saudis prefer to see the UAE as their junior partner, but in many respects it is MBZ who drives the policy. From early on, he opposed bin Nayef's rise, in part because of an unresolvable dispute between the two men. In a 2003 U.S. diplomatic cable published by WikiLeaks, thanks guys, MBZ was quoted as comparing bin Nayef's father to an ape, suggesting that he provided evidence that Darwin was right. Oh my. The former American official with contacts in the region told me after that there was no possibility of a relationship between MBZ and bin Nayef. More importantly, MBZ saw MBS as a younger version of himself, smart, energetic, and eager to confront enemies. As MBS was being groomed for power, the Gulf states were feeling increasingly vulnerable. When the Arab Spring erupted in 2011, it forced out dictators in Tunisia, Egypt, and elsewhere. Leaders in Saudi Arabia and the Emirates were terrified that their monarchies would soon follow. The emergence of ISIS further alarmed them, and the two countries supported proxies to fight against its incursions in Syria and in Libya. But their most decisive intervention came in Egypt, the Arab world's most populous country, where the longtime strongman Hosni Mubarak was ousted by a popular uprising. In June 2012, Egyptian voters delivered the presidency to Mohamed Morsi of the Muslim Brotherhood. For the Saudis and the Emiratis, it was a nightmare. The Brotherhood, founded in 1928, is the world's largest Islamist movement with hundreds of millions of followers. It has inspired Islamist political parties throughout the Sunni Muslim world, including branches in Jordan, Syria, and Bahrain. In Egypt, security services had savagely repressed the Brotherhood for decades. After the Arab Spring, though, it emerged as the country's most organized political force. When Morsi got elected, the Saudis and the Emiratis went into overdrive. A former senior American diplomat told me, according to several former American officials, MBZ and Bandar bin Sultan, the director of Saudi intelligence, began plotting with others in their governments to remove Morsi from power. Egypt's generals were already organizing against him. Bandar and MBZ reached out to the Egyptian defense minister, General Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, and promised $20 billion in economic aid if Morsi were deposed. The Emirati embassy did not respond to requests for comment. They also began financing an anti-government movement in Cairo, built around an ostensibly independent youth group called Tamarad. No idea whether that's being pronounced correctly. As the coup took shape, Bandar and Sisi used Mohammed Dahlan, a Palestinian confidant, to carry messages and money to collaborators in the Egyptian military. The former diplomat said that the foreign support was crucial to the coup. For Sisi to move like that, he needed a promise that he would succeed. In July 2013, the Egyptian military forced Morsi from power, and soon afterward, it orchestrated a crackdown on suspected Brotherhood supporters, detaining at least 40,000 people. It was terrible, terrible, the diplomat told me. What the Saudis and the Emiratis did was unforgivable. As MBS gained influence in the kingdom, he and MBZ built a close relationship. They talk on the phone all day to each other, like Trump. Clark told me, the two royals share a view of geopolitics. MBS has referred to the Muslim Brotherhood and its allies as forces of evil, and like MBZ, he considers Iran his country's great enemy. The rivalry dates to the time of the Safavid Empire, which swept out of Persia in the 1500s and ruled parts of the Arab world for 2 centuries. In recent years, let's get back to the recent years, Saudi and Emirati officials have watched in alarm as the Shiite regime in Iran has established an increasingly dominant presence throughout the region. The Nazis and the Iranian regime are ideologically very similar. Thamar al-Sabhan, the Saudi Minister for Gulf Affairs, told me, the Iranians were assembling a new Islamic army that relies on chaos and aggression, he said. See, Trump should love them. They don't want to weaken Saudi Arabia. They want to take over the region altogether. Their only speed bump is the kingdom. In 2009, the Obama White House began negotiating with the Iranians to limit their nuclear program. Saudi and Emirati leaders viewed any outreach to Iran as dangerously misguided. An American national security official recalled visiting the Emirates in 2011 to meet MBZ. He told me that he was instructed to wait on a dock on the Persian Gulf. Eventually, MBZ pulled up in a speedboat wearing shorts, flip-flops, and a Bass Pro Shop hat. He read us the riot act, the official recalled. He told us that we were naive about the Iranians and that we were giving away the whole region to them. That was always what the Emiratis and Saudis said. We were naive. We thought they were reckless. After MBS was named defense minister, the tension with the Obama administration intensified, particularly over another conflict with Iran, this one in Yemen, which borders Saudi Arabia to the south. Yemen is a poor country, perpetually beset by internal violence. For 3 decades, Saudi Arabia had spent millions of dollars a year subsidizing tribal leaders there in order to buy a little peace. In recent years, the country had fallen into civil war, and after a ceasefire brokered by the Saudis fell apart, a Shiite-dominated rebel group known as the Houthis had swept into the capital and forced the president to flee. Saudi leaders were deeply suspicious of the Houthis, whom the Iranians periodically supplied with weapons. In March of 2015, the Saudis and the Emiratis informed the White House that they were preparing a military intervention in Yemen. MBS told us he wanted us with them, but that they were going anyway, a former State Department official told me. For years, the Obama administration had been telling the Saudis that they had to carry more weight in the region. Now it seemed MBS was calling their bluff. The administration declined to directly join the campaign, but soon after the war began, Tony Blinken, the Deputy Secretary of State, flew to Riyadh to meet with MBS. He told me his goal was to eradicate all Iranian influence in Yemen, Blinken said. He was taken aback. To purge Iran's sympathizers from the country would require a bloodbath. I told him, you could do many things to minimize or reduce Iranian influence, but eliminate it? After MBS sent Saudi forces into Yemen, the Emiratis circulated celebratory photo montages online in which MBS looked on sternly as lions and fighter jets menaced his foes. As the war increased MBS's influence in Saudi Arabia, he began pushing more aggressively to become crown prince. In the summer of 2015, Adel al-Jubeir, the Saudi foreign minister, was dispatched to Nantucket to see Secretary of State Kerry, who was vacationing at his house there. Jubeir wanted to know whether Kerry would support MBS if he pushed bin Nayef aside, according to a former Obama administration official who was briefed on the meeting. MBS was trying to play Kerry, the official told me. He wanted us on his side. Kerry said that the administration wasn't going to take sides. At about the same time, the official told me bin Nayef was reaching out to John Brennan, who was then head of the CIA, to seek support against MBS. Inside the Obama White House, fears grew that the struggle for succession would turn violent. As defense minister, MBS controlled the army. As interior minister, bin Nayef controlled the country's vast internal security forces. You had the possibility of the princes going to war with each other with tanks in the streets, the former official said. In Washington, MBZ undertook a campaign to help establish MBS as the next Saudi king. The Saudis and the Emiratis have the most effective lobbying operation in Washington. Ben Rhodes, Obama's deputy national security advisor, told me. I would say they are more responsible for the image of Obama as being soft in the Middle East than anyone else. They trashed us all around town. Rhodes described Youssef al-Otaiba, we've heard that name, the UAE's ambassador to the United States, as especially capable. Otaiba, an urbane man with a shaved head and a wardrobe of immaculately tailored suits, meets often with America's financial and political elites, sometimes arriving by private jet. Otaiba extolled MBS to a range of powerful ex-officials, including David Petraeus, the former general who is now at the investment firm Kohlberg Kravis Roberts, and Tom Donilon, who served as President Obama's national security advisor. In discussions with members of the Obama administration, he described his client in prophetic terms. MBS is going to be king for 50 years, a former senior White House official recalled him saying. Otaiba also appears to have helped organize a series of op-eds promoting MBS in which he demonstrated unusual influence over prominent Washington figures. I know you have a PR firm, Frances Townsend, former President George W. Bush's counterterrorism advisor, wrote to Otaiba as she proposed an article favorable to MBS. Let me know if there is someone I should work with that might provide a draft for me to begin from. The former American official with contacts in the region said that Otaiba's work was part of a larger effort in which the Emiratis hired other lobbyists on MBS's behalf. Otaiba denied this. All these public relations firms that were promoting MBS in the United States were paid for by Abu Dhabi, the official said. Bin Nayef, alarmed by what he saw as foreign interference, wrote, that gives me a laugh now, wrote to King Salman to warn him. The letter was given to me by the former American official. We are facing a dangerous conspiracy, he wrote. An Emirati plot has been exposed to help aggravate the differences within the royal court. He added, Bin Zayed is currently planning to use his strong relationship with the United States president to achieve his intentions. In December 2016, MBZ flew to New York to meet with President-elect Trump, Kushner, Bannon, and Michael T. Flynn, the notorious spy, who had been appointed National Security Advisor. It's customary for foreign leaders to notify the American government when they travel to the U.S., but MBZ did not do so. The meeting has since reportedly captured the interest of Robert Mueller, who is looking into allegations that Emirati lobbyists funneled millions of dollars to Trump campaign donors. MBZ arrived at the meeting in the Trump Tower penthouse with an entourage of about 30 people. He was dressed in combat boots and jeans, and some of his men were armed. For most of the first hour, he and the Trump aides engaged in a relatively conventional discussion of Middle East policy, but the talk grew more animated as the two sides realized that they shared a common fixation on Iran. The meeting evolved into a planning session on how the Trump White House would confront the Iranian regime in the Gulf. A few weeks later, just after the inauguration, Kushner began advocating a new outreach to Saudi Arabia. In his plan, Trump would visit Riyadh for a summit of 55 Muslim-majority countries. Jared was the engine for all this, the former defense official said. In a single gathering, Trump could introduce himself to the Muslim world, reestablish America's relationship with Saudi Arabia, put Iran on notice, and communicate to everyone present how the administration felt about MBS. The whole establishment was opposed to it. State, DOD, Treasury, everyone, the former defense official said. There were concerns about endorsing MBS and rupturing the relationship with Bin Nayef. The fear was, you can't engage with MBS. You can't be doing this stuff because that's going to upset things. It might show favoritism. We've got a partner. Let's stick with stability. Well, you know he couldn't do that, obviously. At a meeting, aides raised reservations about the summit. We go around the room like this for an hour or so, the official said, and Jared stood up and said, all right, I understand this is ambitious, but we won't know if the Saudis will deliver unless we really test them. The summit in May 2017 was Trump's first overseas trip as president. The Saudis treated him as a fellow monarch, spending an estimated $68 million on festivities, including a ceremony in which Trump and a group of royals danced with swords in hand to a traditional chant. I would like to have seen the video of that. In meetings, Bannon told me, Trump was blunt about American aims. He can't be subtle about anything, we know that. Number one, Trump said to them, stop funding Islamic terrorism. No more effing games. He, of course, uses the whole word, but you can do that in the New Yorker, but not here. At the summit, the Saudis, the Qataris, and others promised to fight extremism, and the Saudis agreed to pay for a jointly run counterterrorism center. The United States announced that it would sell the Saudis some $110 billion worth of arms. I don't think all that panned out, did it? A Pentagon official later said, When completed, it will be the largest single arms deal in American history. Like the pledge to fight terrorism, these agreements were non-binding, but Bannon maintained that Trump had produced a decisive change in Saudi policy. Yeah, huge change in Saudi policy, buying billions of dollars worth of American weapons. In the American press, the summit was noted largely for its pageantry, which culminated in the opening of the Counterterrorism Center, where Trump, King Salman, and Sisi posed in a huddle around a luminous globe. The late-night host, Stephen Colbert, cracked, "Fellas, if I may, you need to work on your not looking like supervillain skills." But in the months that followed, a series of dramatic events suggested that the attendees had quietly made a number of major decisions. Trump declared that the U.S. would move its embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, something that no American president had attempted since Israel occupied the West Bank in 1967. MBS leapfrogged over bin Nayef to become crown prince, and the Gulf monarchies, led by Saudi Arabia, entered an open confrontation with Qatar. The first sign of conflict came on the evening of May 23rd, when a series of unusual quotations began to crawl across the bottom of television screens tuned to the official news agency of Qatar, a tiny thumb-shaped emirate on the Persian Gulf. "Iran is an Islamic power in the region that cannot be ignored," one said. "Hamas is the legitimate representative of the Palestinian people," another said. The statements would have been unremarkable except that they were attributed to Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani, the Emir of Qatar. For a royal in the Gulf, an open endorsement of Iran is explosive. Thani claimed that the remarks were fakes, planted on screen by hackers working for enemies of Qatar, but they prompted a stern reaction. Saudi Arabia's most prominent news network aired coverage, widely understood to have been personally overseen by MBS, that attacked the Qatari leadership. "Doha has lost its mind," a prominent intelligence official said. In a statement on June 5th, the Saudi government accused Qatar of dividing internal Saudi ranks, instigating against the state, infringing on its sovereignty, adopting various terrorist and sectarian groups aimed at destabilizing the region. The same day, Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, along with Bahrain, announced that they were blockading Qatar and breaking off diplomatic relations. The moves were effectively acts of war. The Gulf countries that joined in the blockade had long accused Qatar of financing terrorism and revolution across the Middle East and of aligning itself too closely with Iran. In 2013, they were divided by the crisis in Egypt, with Qatar providing financial support for the Morsi government and the Saudis and Emiratis backing the army. Saudi and Emirati leaders complained about Qatar's sponsorship of the Muslim Brotherhood and of Hamas, the Palestinian group that rules Gaza and whose roots are in the Brotherhood. They also resent the popularity of the state-funded television network Al Jazeera, which is often sharply critical of the Gulf monarchies. MBS has spoken dismissively of Qatar as a nagging problem that can, with sufficient resolve, easily be fixed. Qatari behavior toward the Arab countries is motivated by psychological problems, he said. One Saudi minister could solve the whole Qatari crisis. The U.S. government has a complex relationship with Qatar, which has often been willing to facilitate difficult diplomatic maneuvers. Although the United States lists Hamas as a terrorist organization, a former American diplomat told me that after the group's leader, Khaled Meshal, was forced to flee the Assad regime in 2012, American diplomats asked the Qataris to take him in. Since then, he has lived in a compound around the corner from the U.S. ambassador's residence. The Qataris also host a de facto embassy for the Taliban, where U.S. diplomats can speak with Taliban officials. Bo Bergdahl, the American soldier who had been captured by the Taliban in Afghanistan, was released through negotiations conducted there. Perhaps most important, Qatar is the site of Al Udeid Air Base, the U.S. military's principal forward base in the region, which houses some 11,000 military personnel and hundreds of combat aircraft. The Qataris funded its construction and continue to pay most of its operating costs, which Donald Trump loves, which I guess made it easy for him to make up with them later on, eh? All of these things we have done at the request of the Americans or in coordination with them, Qatar's foreign minister, Mohammed bin Abdulrahman, told me. Nevertheless, after the blockade began, President Trump tweeted his support, writing, "During my recent trip to the Middle East," remember, we're talking Trump here, "I stated that there can no longer be funding of capital R radical capital I ideology. Leaders pointed to Qatar. Look!" What an ending. What a presidential ending to a tweet. The former American diplomat suggested that this enthusiasm... Oh, wait. Enthusiasm. Where's my button? Oh, right. We switched the button over to the trombone thing. So now I have less enthusiasm for playing the trombone. All right. Well, a helpful diversion there. A former American diplomat suggested that this enthusiasm was partly motivated by ignorance. Partly. That's funny. "I am convinced that Trump didn't know that we had a military base in Qatar. He had no idea." I think we're back to the trombone on that one. Oh, my God.
Well, what the hell is supposed to do, you moron?
I don't know. It's okay. Anyway, other senior officials expressed horror. Oh, horror. We can use this one. We're unnecessarily stretching things. So other senior officials expressed horror. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson and Secretary of Defense James Mattis were on a trip to Australia when the crisis broke, and they were taken by surprise, to say the least. Tillerson was very upset. A senior State Department official told me he couldn't believe that the Saudis and others would try something like that. Well, they would. Tillerson began working to ease tensions. Mattis called the Saudis and urged them to stand down. Mattis told MBS, "It's not the time for a war." A former senior Pentagon official told me the phone call didn't go very well. American officials became so worried about the possibility of a military clash that they sent a drone to monitor the border. That doesn't sound like that worried, but okay. In the days that followed, the Saudis and their allies imposed conditions that appeared designed to reduce Qatar to a vassal state. In order for the blockade to be lifted, the country would, among other things, have to close Al Jazeera and sever relations with Iran. American officials concluded that MBS and MBZ were preparing to overthrow Qatar's government. They have made it clear, privately and publicly, that their intention was to replace the emir, the former American diplomat told me. "I think they were going to invade." Qatar presented an almost irresistible target. Though its population is barely 300,000, it controls one of the world's largest natural gas fields and has a sovereign wealth fund worth an estimated $300 billion. If you look at it from a financial perspective, invading Qatar makes a lot of sense, the diplomat said. The government of Turkey, which had a military base in the capital, sent a new detachment of soldiers. And think about it. I guess if you take over the country, you just take the sovereign wealth fund. We're the sovereign now. It's just a province of, I imagine, Saudi Arabia, but I guess the two of them could fight over it. Behind the scenes, there were indications that the plan had been approved at the summit in Riyadh. As the blockade was getting underway, a senior American official received a telephone call just before midnight from Youssef Al-Otaiba, the Emirati ambassador, who told him what was happening. "I was very angry," the official told me. "I tried to talk him out of it." When the official complained that the State Department had been given no notice, Otaiba suggested that he'd already announced it to the administration. "I've informed the White House," he said. "A former American intelligence official told me it was inconceivable that the Saudis or Emiratis would have acted without approval from the U.S. I think it's pretty well understood that the White House gave the green light," the official told me. A senior administration official denied this. American diplomats knew almost nothing about what was happening between the White House and the Gulf monarchies. Troubling, yes. More than a year into Trump's term, he had still not named an ambassador to Saudi Arabia. Nobody knows what's happening in Riyadh because there were no diplomats in the room, the former American diplomat told me. At a speech several months after the crisis in Qatar erupted, Bannon told an American audience, "I don't think it was just by happenstance that 2 weeks after that summit, we saw the blockade." I don't think anybody really thinks that. And of course, there was no ambassador and no diplomats in Saudi Arabia or in the room because Jared Kushner was there and they didn't want any interference or anybody who was in the who could conceivably say no or object or even monitor what was being said. Some Qataris speculate that Kushner endorsed the blockade partly out of frustration over a failed deal with his family's real estate firm. In April, a month before the summit, Qatar's finance minister, Ali Sharif Al-Emadi, flew to New York to examine new investment opportunities. He and his entourage rented a suite at the St. Regis Hotel, cleared away most of the furniture, and received a long line of American businessmen who were looking for funding. According to a financial analyst with knowledge of the meeting, among the hopefuls were Kushner's father, Charles, and his sister, Nicole. They came seeking money to rescue the family's signature property, 666 Fifth Avenue, a 41-story tower in Midtown Manhattan, which generates gallingly low returns and carries a mortgage due next February of $1.2 billion. Charles Kushner has maintained that the Qataris requested the meeting and that he attended out of politeness, but was too wary of conflicts of interest to accept funding. He's very Trump-like himself, eh? The financial analyst, however, said that Kushner pitched a huge renovation of the property, which included bringing in retail stores and converting offices to residences, and hosted a follow-up meeting the next day at 666 Fifth. He asked for just under $1 billion, he told me. The Qataris declined, citing dubious business logic. They could have bought the building. Believe me, they have the money, the analyst said. They just didn't think it would ever pay off. The analyst worried that refusing the deal had a political cost. Here's a question for you. If they had given Kushner the money, would there have been a blockade? I don't think so. As the conflict wore on, op-ed writers and social media posts kept up a drumbeat against Qatar. Many of them came from a curious source, the SCL Group, the parent company of the political research firm Cambridge Analytica. Had to do that one, right? Before the election, Bannon was, of course, vice president of Cambridge Analytica, which was financed by Robert Mercer, the billionaire investor and Trump supporter. SCL had been retained by the Emirati government. This was not known at the time because the firm did not declare to the U.S. government that it was working for the UAE until the following month. Eventually, U.S. intelligence analysts determined that the Qataris had been telling the truth. The televised statements attributed to Amir Thani had been fabricated by hackers hired by the United Arab Emirates, who, of course, had just hired, you know who, Cambridge Analytica. Yes, the hacking was a pretext for us to be attacked, bin Abdul Rahman, the Qatari foreign minister told me, and it is Abdul Rahman, I'm sure. Other indications emerged that the crisis had been premeditated. Last summer, Otaiba's emails were hacked. Financial documents found among them showed that Emirati officials had, through a bank in Luxembourg, plotted a campaign of financial warfare aimed at causing Qatar's currency to crash. Qatar remains under blockade by the allied countries in the Gulf. The blockade has inflicted deep losses on the economy and forced leaders to find alternative sources of food and consumer goods. Of course, this is an old article. I don't believe that the blockade is still happening. But I guess I'm not 100% positive on that. But they continue, the Qataris are rich enough to endure without too much hardship, and they have emerged from the crisis as objects of sympathy. In June, Mattis approved a deal to sell Qatar $12 billion worth of American-made F-15 fighter jets. At a subsequent gathering, Tillerson reassured regional officials that Qatar was a strong partner and longtime friend of the United States. On the evening of June 21st, viewers of Al Arabiya, the Saudi state news channel, witnessed a surreal scene. MBS, his face shrouded by a red and white checkered kafia, strode up to his rival bin Nayef, theatrically kissed his hand, and dropped to his knees. Before MBS could explain himself, bin Nayef declared his fidelity to his cousin. I pledge allegiance to you through the best and the worst. MBS stood up and, furiously shaking bin Nayef's hand, offered his own affirmation. We will always seek your guidance. The film clip, 24 seconds long, was intended to announce that MBS had peacefully succeeded bin Nayef as the next king of Saudi Arabia. In fact, the transfer of power was anything but amicable. The night before, according to Saudi and American sources, bin Nayef had been summoned to a meeting with King Salman. At the palace, guards surrounded him, confiscated his phone, and demanded that he abdicate. Bin Nayef refused. According to the former American official with contacts in the region, he was forced to stand for several hours, which, because of lingering injuries from the suicide attack, caused excruciating pain. One source told me that the guards threatened to announce that bin Nayef was addicted to painkillers, an allegation that the former American official dismissed. I really doubt he did anything like that. As dawn neared, bin Nayef agreed to surrender his position. MBS installed a new interior minister, a relative believed to be loyal to him. Bin Nayef was confined to his house, where even some of his most powerful American friends, including the former CIA directors George Tenet and John Brennan, were not able to reach him. MBS's way to the throne was finally clear. In the months that followed, MBS pushed a sweeping reform agenda, decreeing, among other things, that women be allowed to drive. The Saudi state has long ruled through an alliance with the standard bearers of the Wahhabi creed, who, in exchange for their loyalty, were given permission to disseminate stringent and antiquated doctrines. MBS drastically scaled back funding for the spread of Wahhabism abroad, which many experts believe to be responsible for encouraging terrorism and virulently anti-Western ideas. All we are doing is going back to what we were: moderate Islam that is open to all religions and open to the world, MBS told a gathering at the Ritz-Carlton in Riyadh in October. We will not waste 30 years of our lives in dealing with extremist ideas. We will destroy them today. These moves drew widespread, if not unanimous, praise in the West. Thomas Friedman, talked to a taxi driver probably, the influential foreign affairs columnist for the Times, described visiting MBS and returning convinced that his reforms, if they succeed, quote, will not only change the character of Saudi Arabia, but the tone and tenor of Islam across the globe. Friedman wrote that the young crown prince had kept him up until 1:30 in the morning, discussing national renewal until he pleaded exhaustion. It has been a long time, he wrote, since any Arab leader wore me out with a fire hose of new ideas for transforming his country. Okay. The column inspired outrage among critics of Saudi Arabia. The Al Jazeera journalist Mehdi Hassan called it an embarrassment. At a Brookings Institution event a few days later, Friedman responded brusquely, I got news for you. The entire Arab world is dysfunctional right now, he said. And so when I see someone who's having the balls to take on the religious component of that, to take on the economic component, to take on the political, with all of his flaws, I want to stick my head up and say, God, I hope you succeed. And when you do that, the holy hell comes down on you. Well, F that is my view, okay? So he's back to suck it, Friedman. That's terrific. Oh, great things usually come from that. What was I going to say about this? There was something that he was, besides the gobbledygook he was spewing. There was the, changing the character of Saudi Arabia, not only Saudi Arabia, but the tone and tenor of Islam across the globe, which I guess I was going to just comment. I guess there's a possibility that's the case to the extent that they fund the construction and staffing of the what we now call the madrasas around the world, and that they teach Orthodox Sunni Wahhabi doctrine. I guess to the extent that that is either no longer funded or something else is funded in its place, it really could possibly change the tenor of the way Islam is viewed by Muslims around the world. That's entirely possible, I guess. But, having it told to you by, Mr. Taxi Driver talking suck it Friedman doesn't really help me believe that. Thankfully, I've read it elsewhere. As MBS was being debated in the Western media, he began to systematically eliminate any potential opponents of his rule. In the next several months, Saudi police enforced a crackdown on what remained of the country's independent press and pro-reform groups, arresting human rights activists, pro-democracy organizers, and prominent journalists. Most of the clerics he is arresting are not the hardline clerics, but the reformers, because they're popular. Jamal Khashoggi, a Saudi journalist who recently fled to the U.S., told me. Soon after becoming crown prince, MBS had asked Western and Saudi banks to help assemble a financial picture of the country's wealthiest men. On November 4th, he sent police across the country to arrest scores of people, including more than a dozen members of the royal family, on allegations of corruption. It was a breathtaking assault on the most powerful class of Saudis who had enriched themselves, often with bribes and kickbacks facilitated by links to the royal family. MBS warned, anyone who is involved in corruption will not be spared, whether he is a prince, a minister, or whoever he is. If there is enough evidence against him, he will be held accountable. And I'll get his money. P.S. Some 200 detainees were brought to the Ritz-Carlton in Riyadh, a domain for princes, but not usually for princes under arrest. Among them were the country's leading plutocrats, including a dozen senior princes, owners of one of the country's major television networks, the head of the National Guard, and Al-Walid bin Talal, a major shareholder in Citibank. He sounds familiar to me. Citibank, 21st Century Fox, Apple, and Twitter. Yes, that's right. And who has a net worth of $17 billion. Many were rattled by their first encounter with any restrictions on their lives. Ali Shihabi, who runs a pro-Saudi think tank in Washington, spoke to several detainees and told me that everyone endured the same protocol. They were told to remove their clothes and were given a uniform and a medical exam, during which they were asked if they were taking any prescription drugs. Then they were led to guarded rooms where the doors had been removed, along with the mirrors and anything else that they might use to harm themselves. They could watch TV, order room service, Shihabi told me. They just couldn't leave. Then the interrogations began, with police and investigators presenting the detained Saudis with purported evidence of their misdeeds. A figure was usually arrived at, under coercion, and once the detainees paid up and signed a non-disclosure agreement, they were free to leave. That's a good one. There was no due process of any sort. No courts, no judges, no warrants, none of that, a Western diplomat told me. Many wealthy Saudis who were not targeted in the crackdown frantically moved their money out of the country, the beginning of a capital flight that totaled millions of dollars a month. And you know what's a good place for that? Trump apartments. While MBS was preaching austerity to his countrymen, he seemed unwilling to restrain himself. In 2015, while vacationing in the south of France, he had bought a yacht, the Serene, from a Russian vodka tycoon. What? No way. For $550 million. He bought a chateau west of Paris with a cinema and a moat with a submerged glass chamber for viewing carp. Yum, I'll pass. And last November, he reportedly spent $450 million on Salvator Mundi, the Leonardo da Vinci portrait of Jesus Christ, which is an interesting choice. He's a prophet in Islam. A spokesman for the royal family dismissed these reports, saying that a distant relative of MBS had bought the painting. It was meant to hang in the newly opened Louvre Abu Dhabi. Really? Where the Crown Prince's friend MBZ had recently welcomed the first visitors. In the Saudi and Western media, MBS described the arrests as a crackdown on corruption, which he claims has recovered more than $100 billion for the state, which is him. He was sending a message that the old era was over. No, he wasn't. That corruption would no longer be tolerated. Bernard Heikel, a professor of Near Eastern Studies at Princeton, who has often met with the Crown Prince, told me. MBS seems happy to have amplified his message, even if it was through brutal interrogations. At least one prominent Saudi died in unclear circumstances. According to a Saudi with knowledge of events, Ali al-Qahtani, I'm guessing at that pronunciation, but it looks like it, a retired army general, died of a heart attack after being subjected to harsh treatment during interrogation in the Ritz. I wonder if he was one of those people who thought that the harsh treatment wasn't torture. A detainee also told Saudi what? Also told the Saudi that Amr al-Dabagh, a former senior official with the Saudi Investment Authority, was subjected to electric shocks at the hotel. Yow. Some of those who had been inside the Ritz-Carlton reported that the captors spoke English to one another, which raised the possibility that MBS had recruited foreigners to help him. Heikel defended the detentions, saying that without them, Saudi Arabia would continue on its unsustainable path. MBS knows that the system is incapable of reforming itself, he said. No, it isn't. It's a system that allows, an absolute monarch at the top. It looks like I'm sure he thinks he's doing a fine job reforming it, but okay. Well, why? Because the system as it presently stands has lots of royals and hangers-on and businessmen who are feeding at the trough and will never agree to disenfranchise themselves. Oh, we have that problem. Dang. Even so, it seems clear that MBS's campaign functioned at least as much as an attack on those who might constitute a threat to his rule. What a coincidence. Many of those arrested were relatives of previous kings, young men who considered themselves possible heirs to the throne, or at least to some aspect of the kingdom's power. The most telling arrest was that of Prince Miteb bin Abdullah, the head of the National Guard and the son of the late King Abdullah. By removing Miteb, MBS gained effective control over all three of the country's security branches, the Army, the Interior Ministry, and the National Guard. He can now do whatever he wants. Khashoggi, the Saudi journalist, said, all the checks and balances are gone. And Trump perks up an ear. In late October, Kushner paid an unpublicized visit to MBS, his third trip to the kingdom since the election. Though Kushner was supposed to focus on a plan for peace between Israel and Palestine, he had evidently decided that the more pressing goal was to unite the region against Iran. Soon after Kushner departed, MBS held a meeting with Mahmoud Abbas, the leader of the Palestinian Authority, to discuss the prospects for peace in the Middle East. According to a former Obama administration official, the Saudis presented a plan that was radically favorable to Israel. It would recognize Israel's claims to Jerusalem and ratify nearly all of its settlements on the West Bank, offering the Palestinians only limited autonomy in areas under their control. A senior Palestinian official told me that Arab leaders have been applying intense pressure to Abbas, apparently in cooperation with the Trump administration. The whole idea is to settle the Jerusalem issue so the White House can build a united front against Iran. But, he said, if Jerusalem is on the table, we will never do it. Around the same time, MBS summoned Saad Hariri, the Lebanese prime minister, to Riyadh. Oh yes, remember this? Hariri got the call as he was preparing for lunch with François Nissen, the French Minister of Culture, but he was not in a position to ignore MBS. Hariri was a Saudi citizen, and his construction company, Saudi Oger, perhaps O-G-E-R, which was deeply in debt, had done millions of dollars worth of projects for the Saudi state. MBS's relationship with Hariri had deteriorated because of the ongoing proxy war with Iran. Since the Saudis and the Emiratis intervened in Yemen nearly 3 years earlier, things had gone disastrously wrong. The Houthis still occupied the capital, and Iranian elite commandos and operatives from Hezbollah were training new rebel fighters. Even more pressing, the Iranians had smuggled in missiles, which the rebels were using to bombard Saudi Arabia. In an effort to stop the missiles, the Saudis and the Emiratis blockaded Yemeni ports, which intensified the humanitarian disaster. More than 10,000 people have died, and hundreds of thousands more are facing famine and outbreaks of cholera. Adding to MBS's anxiety was Hezbollah's position inside Lebanon. Since the Lebanese Civil War ended in 1990, Saudi Arabia had given the country billions of dollars to help it rebuild, only to watch as Hezbollah grew into the strongest party and the dominant military force. For several years, the American and Saudi governments had teamed up to build a Lebanese army as a counterweight. In 2016, a year after MBS took over as defense minister, he canceled $3 billion of military aid, concluding that it was a waste of money. He felt like every dollar he sent to Lebanon was supporting Hezbollah, the former American official who sees MBS periodically told me. The Saudis hoped that Hariri would be able to confront Hezbollah. He was a Sunni and an experienced politician who had served as prime minister from 2009 to 2011, when he fled to Paris, largely out of fear that Hezbollah was preparing to kill him. His fears were not unfounded. In 2005, his father, Rafiq, another Saudi-backed prime minister, was killed in a car bomb attack for which a UN tribunal has indicted 4 members of Hezbollah. In 2016, after 2 years of parliamentary deadlock in which the country operated without a head of state, he returned and took office. But Hariri was unable to thwart Hezbollah, even as MBS pushed him to take a tougher stand. The breaking point came in early November. As the rebels continued to fire missiles across the border, Ali Velayati, yes, a senior Iranian leader, flew to Lebanon and met with Hariri. According to the former American official, Velayati said that Iran intended to continue asserting itself in the region. Afterward, Hariri posed, smiling, for a picture with him. When word reached MBS, he was enraged. He felt like he had to do something, the official said. When Hariri was summoned to meet MBS, he expected a warm reception from the royal family. Saad was thinking that all his problems with MBS would be solved, an aide to Hariri told me. Instead, in Riyadh, he was confronted by police who took him into custody. According to 2 former American officials active in the region, he was held for 11 hours. The Saudis put him in a chair, and they slapped him repeatedly. This is the prime minister of another country. This was according to one of the officials. Hariri's spokesman denied this, of course. At the end, in a surreal video that was played on Saudi television, Hariri, looking exhausted and drawn, read a resignation speech claiming that he had fled Lebanon to evade an Iranian plot to kill him. Hariri, who is usually soft-spoken, declared that Iran's hands in the region will be cut off, a statement that convinced many Lebanese that the speech had been written by someone else. It was unclear who would become Lebanon's new prime minister, according to Lebanese and Western officials I spoke to. MBS had tried to enlist Hariri's brother, Baha, who spends much of his time in Monaco, to take the position. A senior American official in the Middle East told me that the plot was, quote, the dumbest thing I've ever seen. That's saying a lot these days. But there were indications that MBS had coordinated his moves with the Trump administration, so you knew it was the dumbest thing you've ever seen, possibly at the summit at Riyadh. A former senior intelligence official who was close to the White House told me that MBS had received a green light to remove Hariri. A senior administration official denied this. It's disruptive, the intelligence official told me. The status quo in the Middle East doesn't work. They want to break it up. Western officials, caught off guard by Hariri's detention, rallied to save him. Tillerson released a statement saying the United States supports the stability of Lebanon and is opposed to any actions that could threaten that stability. Emmanuel Macron, the French president, visited MBS and pressed him to release Hariri. According to a Western diplomat with knowledge of the exchange, MBS opened the conversation by threatening to cut off trade with France unless Macron stopped doing business with Iran. Macron gently replied that a country like France was free to trade with whomever it wished. Macron handled it very well, and MBS backed down, the diplomat told me. Ultimately, the plan collapsed when most of the Lebanese political establishment protested Hariri's captivity. 2 weeks after he had arrived, Hariri was on a plane, going first to meet with officials in Paris and Cairo, and then on to Beirut, where he basked in sympathy. The whole country is unified around him, a senior Hezbollah leader told me. Several days after his return, I went to see Hariri in Beirut. He lives in the Beit al-Wasat neighborhood inside a high-walled compound of exquisitely restored villas with views of the Mediterranean. A few doors down sits the Magen Abraham Synagogue, destroyed during the Civil War and rebuilt with the help of Hariri's family. Despite the grand surroundings, he seemed less a returning hero than an exhausted former prisoner. I don't want to talk about what just happened, he said, slumped behind his desk. MBS was right, okay? What he is doing or trying to do is right. Phew. In March, MBS began a 2-week tour of the U.S. in which he traveled to New York, Boston, Houston, and Los Angeles, seeking investments and attempting to build goodwill. News stories had begun to spread about MBS's relationship with the White House, including one in which he purportedly said that Jared Kushner was, quote, in his pocket. I remember that. Still, at a meeting in the White House cabinet room, Trump and Kushner received him warmly. Saudi Arabia is a very wealthy nation, Trump said afterward in the Rose Garden, and they're going to give the United States some of that wealth, hopefully, in the form of jobs, in the form of the purchase of the finest military equipment anywhere in the world. That same day, the Senate blocked a resolution to limit U.S. involvement in the war in Yemen. In Saudi Arabia, too, MBS is encountering little resistance. Working for MBS is a blessing, Mohammed al-Sheikh, the Saudi Minister of State, told me. He's just gifted. Sheikh spoke of ambitious ventures throughout the country, 110 miles of subway track being dug under Riyadh, a megacity called Neom to be constructed on the Red Sea coast. The cost would be tremendous, he acknowledged, but he said that it would be offset by efficiencies in government achieved by a newly formed agency called the Bureau of Capital and Operational Spending Rationalization. Shoo, oh my. He described the changes as a kind of enlightened revolution. It's a choice, he said. It's not the Arab Spring. This is the leadership deciding that we have a huge potential we need to unlock. But as sweeping as MBS's economic and cultural reforms may be, he has expressed no interest in liberalizing the country's political system. Indeed, the model that seems to best conform to his vision is China, with its dynamic economy, literate population, and authoritarian rule. Experts on the Saudi system, including those who admire MBS, say that his efforts are being carried out with one overriding goal, to preserve the House of Saud. Well, that's the way it is with monarchies, I guess. As MBS neared the end of his first year as crown prince, his position seemed secure. He had eliminated or silenced nearly all potential opposition to his rule. He replaced the generals in charge of the war in Yemen and pushed ahead with his plans to privatize Saudi Arabia's oil industry. At the same time, the waves of arrests created a climate of fear in which even the tamest criticism of the government was labeled disloyal. His purges of rivals and his creation of what amounted to a cult of personality appeared designed to place on MBS the entire burden of governing and to leave the country's institutions enfeebled. I wonder where I've heard that before. His rapid modernization and anti-corruption initiatives, whatever their motivations, seemed sure to inspire legions of enemies. Still, his supporters in both Washington and Riyadh feel that, whatever his faults, the alternative would be worse. In the White House, Kushner's power has been diminished, and his security clearance was revoked amid a series of scandals. Of course, he's since gotten it back. But the appointments of Mike Pompeo as Secretary of State and John Bolton as National Security Advisor presage an even more hawkish era in which there will be few constraints on MBS's regional ambitions. No one would have thought that the Saudi leader could take on the royal family, the clerical establishment, and the country's most powerful businessmen, but he did it. A former American official who has dealt with MBS told me. Sounds like Chuck Todd or someone assessing the optics of a coup like this. Well, it's highly illegal and unconstitutional, but it does appear to be a success. You know what I mean? Anyway, let's see. But success at home convinced him he could get away with the things he did abroad. MBS has always had a combination of vision, hubris, and arrogance, all of which are now playing out. What troubles me about MBS is he learns from his successes, but not his failures. That's the danger. And so things wrap up on this extraordinarily long article, much longer to read through than I originally thought, but meshes well with what we have read about in the past about Saudi Arabia. And although a bit of an unusual turn of focus for us here. I mean, we've spent time on Saudi Arabia and too much time in the past before, but I guess sort of the Trump era and fire after fire has made it impossible to give this much time to anything like this. And, well, maybe this was the perfect opportunity. Moving on now to the second entry in our Summer Friday Saudi Arabia Bonanza in Newsweek magazine, dated August 30th. Rula Jebrial, the author on the piece. Saudi Arabia's Mohammed bin Salman charmed the West, but rules at home with an iron fist. A not unfamiliar story for rulers all around the world, not just in Saudi Arabia. Let's quickly take a look here. The Crown Prince knows how to please. In early March, Mohammed bin Salman, commonly known as MBS, was at Buckingham Palace for lunch with Queen Elizabeth II. It was the first official visit for the 32-year-old, and press coverage was glowing. "He's a revolutionary," proclaimed the Daily Telegraph. British conservatives loved MBS's proposal to privatize Saudi Aramco, his state's oil company, and list it on the London Stock Exchange. A nice boost to the flagging British economy, as well as his reputation as an economic reformer. Later that month, he was in the Oval Office with President Donald Trump, followed by stops in Los Angeles, New York, Houston, Silicon Valley, and Seattle to meet with Hollywood and tech elite, including Oprah Winfrey, Elon Musk, and Google executives. This grand tour marked the Crown Prince's international debut. His 82-year-old father, King Salman, ceded some of his own power last year, commending Vision 2030, MBS's plan for social and economic liberalization. In the Crown Prince's public statements, at least, he endorses the view that Saudi Arabia cannot survive forever on checkbook diplomacy abroad and government welfare at home. The goals include lessening the country's dependence on oil exports, investing in education, entertainment, and tourism, and invigorating the economy, in part by supporting women in the workforce. A decree permitting women to drive, which went into effect in June, bolstered his international image as a reformer. Thanks a heap. But okay, it's something. The arrest last November of a dozen of his royal relatives and ministers accused of skimming on their government deals was reported internationally as an anti-corruption housecleaning, one that added an estimated $100 million to the funds under the prince's control. Gee whiz, that's a strange coincidence. All told, the House of Saud, and thank you for reminding us that's exactly who we're talking about here, House of Saud is worth over $1 trillion. The prince's world travels and moves to burnish his carefully constructed, quote, progressive profile, ouch, marked an aggressive effort to tackle one of the kingdom's key problems. Saudi Arabia's image has never fully recovered from 9/11. The attacks were carried out mostly by Saudi citizens. A declassified 2016 congressional report, which the Saudis went to great lengths to suppress, alleged that the terrorists may have had support from individuals connected to the Saudi government. And a 2009 cable from then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton said, quote, "It has been an ongoing challenge to persuade Saudi officials to treat terrorist financing emanating from Saudi Arabia as a strategic priority." The Crown Prince's own strategic priority is to bury this narrative by pivoting to a new one, that of a westernized consumerist nation hungry for American investment and weapons to confront common enemies. He played the role with impressive elan, eschewing traditional Saudi royal garb for much of his U.S. trip, and even wearing jeans to meet Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg. Zoons, I cannot believe it. At each U.S. stop, MBS was heralded by the media. Fox News gushed over his modernization push. CNN called Saudi Arabia the hottest emerging market right now. It's very hot, I can attest to that, I guess. Just take a look at the temperature. American Media Incorporated, owned by Trump pal David Pecker, you've heard a little bit about him in the last couple of days, published an entire $14 magazine devoted to the Crown Prince. I took a pass on that one. I couldn't get the $14 together. Reporters failed to ask about Saudi Arabia jailing women, such as Samar Badawi and Nasima al-Sada, who had campaigned for the right to drive, and dozens of other civil rights activists, nor did they ask about the humanitarian disaster that is war in Yemen, or how the hundreds of millions the Crown Prince has spent in the recent past on personal possessions fits with his narrative of responsible economic reform. The Saudis have used all their resources to suffocate any democratic impulse in the Arab world, says Professor Madawi al-Rashid, a Saudi anthropologist who has written several histories of the kingdom. For all of the reformist hype, MBS leads an authoritarian regime that brooks no dissent. We should get a hold of one of these histories of the kingdom. Raif Badawi, an atheist blogger, remains in jail, along with his lawyer and prominent human rights activist Walid Abulkhair. Noha al-Balawi, a women's rights campaigner who posted videos challenging Saudi Arabia's normalization of ties with Israel, was arrested in February. Saudi prosecutors have called for the beheading of another female human rights protester, Isra al-Gomgham. I'm guessing at that. Ghomgham. Gomgham. Wow. For participating in peaceful protests. That's a little over the top there. Beheading for peaceful protesting. Okay. She has been imprisoned for 32 months without access to a lawyer. Meanwhile, preachers who spread a radical theology sanctioning the killing of Shiite Muslims, Christians and Jews, by the way, we'll add those to the radical theology sanctioning killings. Wow, it'd kill everybody, I guess. Well, they remain in senior positions of influence, and the puritanical Wahhabi ideology that has fueled extremism across the Muslim world continues to be a major Saudi export. There's another long list of Shiite victims in the oil-rich eastern province who have been tortured, executed, or have simply disappeared because their ideas are dangerous to him and no criticism is tolerated, says Rashid. Democracy is not on the Crown Prince's agenda. Indeed, he personifies the counter-revolution that extinguished the democratic flame that flickered briefly during the Arab Spring. He and allied strongmen across the Middle East have moved ruthlessly to reinvigorate an authoritarian regional order with Riyadh and its core Wahhabi ideology. In other words, make Arabia great again. And I'm glad they dropped the Saudi on that one. Okay. To understand MBS's impressive command of public relations, you must begin in Abu Dhabi, the capital of the United Arab Emirates. In the Western imagination, the UAE is synonymous with Dubai's glass and steel skyscrapers, luxury shopping malls, and indoor ski resorts. Less familiar is its crown prince, Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan, or MBZ, and that is exactly how he likes it. Described in a U.S. diplomatic cable as charismatic, savvy, and very comfortable in the West, he was Washington's preferred candidate for the throne when his brother Khalifa, who their father, but his brother's own illness has made MBZ the UAE's de facto ruler and military chief for at least a decade. The 57-year-old former pilot rapidly expanded the UAE's military spending and defense industry. The country is now one of the world's most militarized nations. But thanks to MBZ's aggressive manipulation of the media, the common perception is that the UAE is an open, tolerant, multicultural force for progress. A lesson in image making that his protege, MBS, has clearly absorbed. In late 2010, the Arab Spring revolutions began in Tunisia and quickly spread to Egypt. MBZ, terrified by the possibility of democracy sweeping the Middle East and bringing to power the Muslim Brotherhood, the largest political movement in the Arab world, argued that pro-democracy protesters were intent not on reform, but on imposing Sharia, Islamic law. And here they might actually be correct. Whereas saying that in the United States, pro-democratic protesters want to impose Sharia law is, couldn't be further from the truth. It's just a dumb excuse. But I suppose that's something you actually have to worry about there. However, I guess it doesn't really resonate all that well when you yourself are sitting atop a monarchy that rules through Sharia law. But hey, who am I to impose logic and order on this? DC firms, the Harbor Group and the Camstol Group aided MBZ's extensive lobbying campaign. By 2012, the UAE's Minister of State for Foreign Affairs, Anwar Gargash, was giving private briefings to Western journalists describing the UAE as an island of stability and tolerance within a dangerous and volatile neighborhood. The state-run National Media Council aggressively criticized Egypt's Brotherhood-led government, elected in the country's first free and fair elections in 2011. Unwilling to accept the verdict of Egypt's electorate, MBZ launched an aggressive effort to restore military rule to power in Cairo. The protests that set the stage for Egypt's 2013 coup were led by the Tamarod, or rebel movement. It says rebel in parentheses. Is that what Tamarod means in Arabic? It appeared to be a grassroots group, but it was heavily funded by the UAE. Sounds familiar. The coup put Abdel Fattah al-Sisi into the presidency, and he quickly suspended the constitution. A month after the coup, Sisi directed the massacre of nearly 1,000 peaceful pro-democracy protesters and Brotherhood activists at Rabah Square. By May 2014, there were close to 41,000 political prisoners in Egypt's jails. Washington and London had initially supported democracy in Egypt, but their response to Sisi's state-orchestrated violence was muted. But Sisi's bread was buttered elsewhere. In leaked recordings of 2014 calls between one of MBZ's key lieutenants, Sultan al-Jaber, and the Egyptian general Abbas Kamil, Sisi's man can be heard pleading for access to more Emirati money to help the new dictator manage a failing economy. Similar methods were used to undermine Tunisia's democracy. Television channels owned by UAE-friendly oligarchs, oh no, not them again, broadcast accusations that Ennahda, that's Ennahda, my best attempt at pronouncing that, the party that won Tunisia's first free elections in 2011, was a part of a Brotherhood conspiracy to impose Islamic law. And Ennahda, though, remains in power. At home, the UAE has clamped down on the local Muslim Brotherhood affiliate, Al-Islah, labeling it a terrorist organization. In 2013, a total of 94 Emirati activists, including lawyers, judges, bloggers, students, and a prince, just threw that one in there for fun, it's true, I guess, were jailed on conspiracy charges. In 2015, the death of Saudi King Abdullah, grandfather of MBS, gave MBZ his most dramatic opportunity to eclipse the old model of Gulf diplomacy, demure, cautious, primarily concerned with presenting a united front. MBS had spent time with MBZ since his teens, and the older Emirati princeling had groomed the young Saudi. The two share an impatience at the perceived timidity of their parents' generation and sought a more aggressive response to regional challenges. But to MBS's more belligerent instincts, MBZ added the finesse of charming the West, deploying lobbyists and PR firms to perpetuate the view of the UAE and Saudi Arabia as the enlightened leaders of the Arab world, facing down the Brotherhood and Iran. Years of lackadaisical investment in PR ended with the ascension of MBS. By 2016, Saudi Arabia was employing 10 lobbying firms, being paid an estimated total of $1.3 million a month, the political website The Hill reported. One of them, King & Spalding, had the job of attempting to soften a law, the Justice Against Sponsors of Terrorism Act. I think we've heard about that one from Adam Bonin, haven't we? That would allow the families of 9/11 victims to sue the Saudi government. A $90,000 contract with Capital Media Group, a firm which has worked on several Islamophobic media campaigns, was subcontracted by another, Corvus, to bring dozens of U.S. military veterans to Capitol Hill to speak against JASTA. That's the acronym for Justice Against Sponsors of Terrorism Act. Imagine that, speaking against it. The bill was passed, overriding a veto attempt by President Barack Obama. For MBS's visit to London in March, billboards and a full-page newspaper ad were accompanied by a more secretive bid to buy influence. An independent nonprofit called the Bureau of Investigative Journalism revealed that one of the kingdom's London firms, Consulum, had a serving senior British diplomat working on the Saudi account, shilling for the dictator on the British taxpayer's dime. And I don't think they have dimes there, but okay. And the parent company of the disgraced Cambridge Analytica, SCL Group, had helped MBS's team identify the sections of Saudi society likeliest to rise up against him. Congratulations on your work there, Cambridge Analytica. If anything, the PR offensive has escalated as conditions at home became more repressive. Dozens of dissidents and driving rights campaigners remain in prison, and one of the most prominent, Lujain? How would we pronounce it? Loujain. Lujain al-Hathlal. My goodness, it's a tough one. Joined them in May. Well, sorry for that, Lujain, not just because I ruined your name. Saudi women still can't travel without the permission of a male guardian, and fathers or brothers can use their guardianship privilege to forcibly separate their daughters or sisters from their husbands. Ali Al-Ahmed, a Saudi exile and director of DC's Institute for Gulf Affairs, says Saudi women have been reduced to slavery by the absolute monarchy. And then there's Yemen. MBS, as defense minister in 2015, became what the Brookings Institution called the face of Yemen's war. Saudi Arabia led a coalition mounting a massive air campaign against that country's Houthi rebels, whom Riyadh sees as Iranian proxies. The war in Yemen has claimed many thousands of civilian lives, infected more than 1 million people with cholera, and could put 18 million people on the brink of starvation. And despite creating the world's largest current man-made humanitarian catastrophe, the Saudis have failed to impose their will on the battlefield. According to an Associated Press investigation, the Saudis and the UAE also cut a secret deal with Al-Qaeda fighters in Yemen, letting them retreat with weapons, equipment, and almost $100 million in looted cash. Many of these fighters were recruited directly into the Saudi coalition forces, a deal that strengthened the most dangerous branch of the extremist network that carried out the 9/11 attacks. Hard time believing that. Well, not hard time believing it. I have a hard time fathoming it, I guess. U.S. officials estimate Al-Qaeda numbers in Yemen at 8,000 members and rising. The Al-Qaeda partnership bears an eerie resemblance to the Saudi and Mujahideen alliance in Afghanistan during the 1980s, which originally gave rise to Al-Qaeda. The catastrophic war and rumors of shady arms deals have made even steadfast Saudi allies queasy. The European Parliament voted in 2016 for an EU-wide arms embargo against Saudi Arabia. Norway has also suspended arms sales to the Emirates. Even Washington's support is wavering. In March, a bipartisan effort led by Senator Bernie Sanders, which would make it a tripartisan effort, managed to get 44 out of 100 U.S. senators to vote for an immediate end to U.S. backing of the Saudi war effort. They have vowed to try again. It's not the sort of publicity MBS is seeking, of course. Nothing disrupts a princely charm offensive like images of Yemeni children killed by a U.S. missile fired by a Saudi coalition warplane. I will agree with that. However, I will say this, that is not a great way to end that piece. I feel like there was perhaps a lot more that could have been said, but an important point certainly to make. At the end, I just don't know if I would have wound up with that one. Well, all right. Another interesting entry in our expanding backgrounders on MBS and MBZ, the new nominal rulers of the entire Gulf region, or at least the Arabian Peninsula at this point. Well, how about if we continue on a Middle Eastern theme here with a return to an article that we began to read on the show some time ago got about halfway through, never actually finished up with it. The most interesting stuff appeared to be at the end. We'll give it another shot here. The Intercept's entry from November 9th, 2017, though we tried to read it again, I guess in the last month or two. Leaked documents exposed stunning plan to wage financial war on Qatar and steal the World Cup. That's the interesting part, I thought. But in the context of the blockade these days of Qatar, and, with mixed results, that blockade, I thought this made for an interesting edition. And it was a more interesting a couple of weeks or even a couple months ago when the World Cup was ongoing. But really an interesting plot here altogether, though it gets a little heavy in the financial jargon. Ryan Grimm and Ben Walsh put this piece together. Let's give it another shot. A plan for the United Arab Emirates to wage financial war against its Gulf rival, Qatar, was found in the task folder of an email account belonging to the UAE ambassador to the United States, Youssef Al-Otaiba, whose name we have called before, and subsequently obtained by The Intercept. I think we even used the phrase that his name has been called before earlier in today's podcast. The economic warfare involved an attack on Qatar's currency using bond and derivative manipulation. The plan, laid out in a slide deck provided to The Intercept through the group Global Leaks, was aimed at tanking Qatar's economy, according to documents drawn up by a bank outlining the strategy. The outline, prepared by Bank Haviland, a private Luxembourg-based bank owned by the family of a controversial British financier, David Rowland, laid out a scheme to drive down the value of Qatar's bonds and increase the cost of insuring them, with the ultimate goal of creating a currency crisis that would drain the country's cash reserves. Rowland has long had a close relationship with UAE leadership, particularly with Abu Dhabi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Zayed, known as MBZ, as you already know. The bank is currently in the process of creating a new financial institution in cooperation with the UAE's sovereign wealth fund, Mubadala, according to contracts and correspondence obtained by The Intercept outlining the terms of the deal. That project is separate from the Qatar operation, but it reflects the close relationship between the bank and the UAE. The Qatar debt project would be grandiose in its ambitions. Control the yield curve, decide the future, reads the planning document, referring to the standard financial industry graph showing a country's borrowing costs for debt that is due at different dates. The height and shape of the yield curve is thought to be a reflection of how healthy an economy is and influences what financing options are available to a country. Targeting a nation's economy using financial manipulation would be a dramatic break from traditional norms of diplomacy and even warfare. But, let's try some new stuff, why don't we? The plan the document presents is far-fetched and appeared to have been put together by someone with little or no experience trading in credit and currency markets. Two industry veterans who reviewed the plan for The Intercept said both were granted anonymity because speaking to the press could jeopardize their employment. I can't believe they put this on paper, one of the credit veterans added. They're talking about colluding to manipulate markets. Oh no, financial people would never do that. There is no conclusive evidence the plan has been initiated, nor that it will ever be launched, and the current pressure Qatar's currency is under as a result of an ongoing blockade imposed by the UAE means those direct overt steps may be more effective economic sabotage than anything the slides outline. Additionally, the publication of this story means the secrecy of the plan says it requires no longer exists. The Intercept reached Edmund Rowland, David's son and CEO of the UK branch of Bank Haviland, at a mobile phone number listed in internal company documents obtained by The Intercept, and asked about the status of the plan to short Qatar on behalf of the UAE, referencing the document. We've never done anything, Rowland said. Asked for more details, he responded, I can't make any comment, and hung up. After the call, Herbert Kozlov, a lawyer with the firm Reed Smith, reached out to The Intercept and said on behalf of the bank that it had not traded in Qatari bonds or credit default swaps, the financial products the plan proposed to use. Bank Haviland does not trade in bonds, securities, CDS, or any other instruments of Qatar, and it has no plans to do so. As for the plan to take down Qatar, he said, the bank is a prestigious private banking group and will not be drawn into or make comments on what are political storylines. The metadata of the slide deck obtained by The Intercept indicates Vladimir Boleli, an analyst with Bank Haviland, as the creator. A call by The Intercept to his receptionist was rebuffed. He's been told by Herb Kozlov not to contact this company, said the receptionist, referring to The Intercept. The Intercept had not previously told Kozlov that Boleli was listed as the author of the document. So you can see where that's going. The new project comes amid, and if implemented would escalate, a regional crisis that reached new heights in June when the UAE and Saudi Arabia led a bloc of Gulf nations in blockading and cutting off diplomatic relations with Qatar. U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, now an ex-Secretary of State, recently, that was back in November of last year anyway, faulted the blockading countries for intransigence, but President Donald Trump has largely taken the opposite approach, emboldening Saudi Arabia and the Emirates at the expense of Qatar, which is home to one of the largest overseas U.S. military bases in the world. Tillerson traveled to the region on October 20th in the latest effort to defuse the crisis. According to a report in the American Conservative, Tillerson previously told people close to him that he believed Trump had undermined him at the behest of Otaiba, the UAE ambassador, working through Trump's son-in-law and White House advisor, Jared Kushner, to whom Otaiba is close. Both Kushner and Trump have reasons to take sides with Otaiba in the dispute. The president has a Trump-branded golf course in Dubai and bragged at a press conference before his inauguration about a deal he was offered by a billionaire Emirati real estate developer. The president's attempts to get his hands on Qatari money have been less successful. On Qatari money have been less successful. I'm sure he got his hands on Qatari people. Let's say probably they're women, but okay. In 2010, Trump traveled to Qatar with his daughter Ivanka in an attempt to secure two different sources of investment funding. He was unceremoniously rebuffed by both. More recently, Kushner sought a $500 million bailout from a Qatari royal as a part of a plan to redevelop his badly underwater flagship investment in a New York office tower. The money for such bailouts often comes from the Gulf. As The Intercept first reported, the Qatari royal agreed to help bail out the Kushners contingent on their ability to raise the rest of the funding they needed from other sources. The remainder of the funding, however, fell through, and the Qatari royal pulled out of the deal. They can't get a goddamn thing done anywhere, these Kushners. After the deal fell apart, Kushner helped orchestrate an unyielding response to the Saudi and UAE-led economic blockade of Qatar, which Trump took credit for sparking with a hardline approach at a summit in Riyadh. Former top White House advisor Steve Bannon also credited Trump with stoking the blockade at a recent event in Washington. I don't think it's just by happenstance that 2 weeks after the summit that you saw the blockade of the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Egypt, and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia on Qatar. Bannon said at a think tank he put in all the countries he could to make it seem more intellectual, you see. And I've said from day one, I fell asleep, sorry. Even with the situation in the Pacific, with Northwest Korea, I think the single most important situation in the world that's happening right now is the situation in Qatar. Well, the Qataris probably agree. In late June, Trump waded further into the conflict with remarks aimed at Qatar during a private fundraiser, according to audio obtained by The Intercept. I'm going to have to listen to this audio because I'd love to hear how he pronounces the country, because he goes on to say, we're having a dispute with Qatar. We're supposed to say, he probably says, we're having a dispute with Qatar. We're supposed to say Qatar, Trump said, mocking the pronunciation of the country's name by varying the syllabic emphasis. It's Qatar. They prefer. I prefer they don't fund terrorism. He's such a wonderful guy. Regional tensions ratcheted up another few notches over the weekend as Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, a close ally of Otaiba and MBZ, arrested dozens of princes and other top officials in a swift consolidation of power, and followed it up with a threat to wage war against Iran. The economic blockade has already directly impacted Qatar's economy, decimating travel, trade, and finance flows in and out of the country. Qatar's sovereign wealth fund recently brought $20 billion back to the country to prop up the country's banking system, and the country's currency is already showing signs of financial stress. Documents marked secret and confidential, outlining the plan for the financial attack against Qatar, were being circulated between Bank Haviland and the Emirati embassy in Washington as recently as late September. That would have been late September 2017. A private financial institution like Bank Haviland would be very familiar with the first step of the plan as laid out in the outline, creating a new offshore investment fund constructed to obscure its links to the UAE. The fund would hold Qatari bonds already owned by the UAE, as well as additional debt the fund could buy. The fund would also buy credit default swaps, which would rise in value as Qatari debt sank. The plan then calls for precipitating a run on the debt through a series of sham transactions to drive down the price of Qatar's bonds, a manipulation technique known as painting the tape, where players swap instruments back and forth to create the false appearance of a high volume of trade. The hope is to get other traders who aren't in on the plan to see the high volume on the tape, the market ticker, and think that since volume is high in a period of political turmoil, something important must be happening, prompting them to sell. The sales, if the technique goes to plan, would drive the price of the bonds down, creating more panic and more selling. According to the plan, the UAE, having bought credit default swaps against the debt, would see the value of that insurance rise as Qatari debt tanked. The document outlining the scheme puts the bond trading proposal in print. Establish a crossing transaction arrangement whereby another affiliated party sells the same bond holdings back to the original seller and thereby creates additional downward pressure. They just confessed to the crime. The hope is to spark a run by bond investors who think everybody else is selling, so they better get out quickly. Falling debt prices and rising costs of the default swaps would signal a fresh crisis to the markets, putting pressure on Qatar's currency. The Qatari rial is pegged to the US dollar, so as its offshore value falls, the country would be forced to spend billions of dollars from its reserves to push it up. In other words, the UAE plans to short Qatar and then drive it into the ground by manipulating international financial markets, all the while gaining diplomatic leverage against its rival. Speculating about a country's currency and economic future is far from unprecedented in the high-flying world of finance, but the difference in this case is that the plan is not designed for a vulture fund bent on a profit, but on a sovereign state looking to undermine a neighboring nation. The plan is not an obvious winner from a profit perspective, which further suggests its goals to be political rather than financial. As the document notes, at the end of the operation, if it's successful, it will be difficult for the UAE to unload its Qatari bonds because the attack would have largely weakened Qatar financially. Rather than outline specifics, the document speaks in a vague, somewhat harebrained tone. It doesn't contain any analysis of Qatari bond, derivative, or currency markets, or an estimate of the total economic firepower the UAE can put behind the plan, nor does it address how much of Qatar's $68 billion in outstanding debt the UAE and its allies already own, or how to respond when, as is likely to happen relatively quickly in these lightly traded markets, the Qataris see strange trades and apply pressure to markets in the opposite direction by buying their bonds, stabilizing the currency, and selling credit default swaps, or whether a successful attack on a pegged currency in the region will whip back and lead to pressure on the UAE dirham, the Saudi rial, and the pegged currencies of their allies. The basic premise of the plan, that Qatar is spending billions of dollars to offset the pain inflicted by the blockade, and that the country's currency is vulnerable, is largely correct. Qatar may be spending tens of billions of dollars to fight the economic effects of the blockade, but it has hundreds of billions of dollars more, And on the record, Qatar insists that it has sufficient reserves to keep its currency pegged to the dollar. As a result, the plan would be anything but a sure bet, financially speaking. Keeping the outline light on details makes sense, says Partnoy, the University of San Diego professor, in the context of the way banks generally operate. Bankers are always trying to sell complicated products that will make them fee income, he said. This is an effort to try to sell something that might be a terrible idea. Now, the third stage of the plan would be to ramp up the PR machine in order to slam Qatar internationally, pointing to its weakening financial situation. Focus on the prospect of restricted access to U.S. dollar and now doubtful stability of the country, the plan reads, and continue to increase positions. In other words, keep the market cornered and feed fears about falling prices with manufactured bad news. Jacob Frankel, the former Securities and Exchange Commission enforcement lawyer and federal criminal prosecutor who has served as an expert witness in market manipulation cases, said the proposal raises serious red flags. Because the plan would likely involve trades in U.S. markets and would use U.S. servers and dollars, American regulators and prosecutors would have jurisdiction over it. Frankel, now a partner at the law firm Dickinson Wright, said, the agreements about timing and pricing of trades are common in manipulation schemes. The use of entities created for the purpose of engaging in transactions to create the perception of an independent market interest is a characteristic found in market manipulative activities, he said. That alone is a red flag that would be of interest to a regulator, and anybody in law enforcement would acknowledge what I'm saying. Now, while the scheme itself would be an ambitious undertaking, the goal is ultimately petty. It's about soccer. One of the plan's stated aims is forcing Qatar to share soccer's 2022 World Cup, according to the outline. The strategy laid out in the document calls for using a public relations campaign to point the international soccer body, FIFA, to Qatar's dwindling cash reserves, making a case that the small Persian Gulf monarchy can't afford to build the necessary infrastructure. The blockade is already raising prices for infrastructure supplies, and recruiting top officials to work in Qatar has been difficult, the slides point out. The outline concludes with the hope that the economic war will make it harder for Qatar to continue building stadiums and other assets needed to host the games. If Qatar now spends its reserves on protecting the currency and domestic credit markets, there's less dry powder to fund the infrastructure spending. The UAE, according to the document, hopes to make a push for the Gulf Cooperation Council, a group of Arab monarchies that includes Qatar, to host the premier global sports event across the member nations, rather than in Qatar alone. On October 20th, several weeks after The Intercept first obtained the document outlining the plan, a well-funded Twitter campaign launched with the goal of taking the World Cup from Qatar, complete with a slickly produced video. And it's tweeted around by a Twitter account identified as Kick Qatar Out. Don't be a spectator to Qatar's human rights abuses. It's more than a game. Stop the abuse. That's some appeal there. An appeal to FIFA will be to display football as a tool to stabilize the region. The document reads, the GCC, Gulf Cooperation Council, can petition FIFA to grant the tournament to the region as a whole. If Qatar rejects the idea, the plan contends, they will be seen as unwilling to work with their GCC partners, one of which would just have launched a surreptitious financial attack against the country. What an amazing situation. What an audacious plan. Will it work? We don't know, but it's not looking like it's going to. It's not even looking like it's going to be launched. But imagine, if you will, the chutzpah of putting together a plan like this. Economic warfare. Yes, okay, to undermine a neighbor. But imagine, as a major goal, getting a piece of the FIFA action. There really just must be a huge pot of gold in that. It makes the corruption surrounding the game a lot easier to understand and a lot easier to fathom anyway. Very interesting.
From Daily Kos Radio, on netrootsradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waldman.
So that'll do it for today, wrapping up our pre-taped Friday spent in the Middle East once again. Hope you'll join us again next week, whether we are live for Labor Day or not. Yet to make that determination. Another signature moment here on the Kagro in the Morning Show.